It was a seemingly normal day in Houston when a pregnant woman, standing at a quiet gas station, unknowingly stepped into the hands of a predator. What started as a simple request for a ride would quickly spiral into an unimaginable nightmare, one that no one could have predicted. What she didn't know as she climbed into the car of a man she thought she could trust was that her life was about to be changed forever. Held at gunpoint, threatened with death, and forced into unspeakable acts, she was trapped in a home where the horrors escalated beyond belief. But the terror didn't stop there. In a cruel twist, the man, 58-year-old Dennis Allen Carter, recorded every moment of her suffering, moments he would later show investigators, claiming it was all consensual. But what truly happened in those dark hours at Kittredge Street? Was she a willing participant in his monstrous acts, or was she a victim, her voice silenced by fear? And as the story unravels, one thing becomes painfully clear. This was not Carter's first crime. It was part of a sickening pattern of abuse, one with a history dating back decades. But how far can a man like this go before the law catches up? And how could the system let him slip through the cracks yet again? Stick with me as we uncover the chilling details of a case that has left the community reeling and questioning everything they thought they knew about justice. What happened inside that house, and what's next for Dennis Allen Carter?
This story we're about to bring you may be triggering for you. Troubling allegations are being made against a man in Northeast Houston that involved alleged sexual assault and his dog. Dennis Allen Carter is behind bars, being held without bond in this case. Reporter Micah Hatfield joins us live to break down exactly what he is accused of. Micah?
Gina, already last week we had an extremely disturbing case out of Montgomery County involving bestiality. People who live near Dennis Allen Carter brought that case up to me when I told them about what happened on.
She had been standing alone, waiting for a ride, when the man, Dennis Allen Carter, pulled up. A man who seemed, at first, like any other stranger offering help. He appeared harmless, just another driver in a city full of faces she would never remember. He wasn't a threat, not yet. Not yet. Without hesitation, she accepted his offer. In that moment, she had no reason to believe she was stepping into a nightmare she would never wake from. The drive to Carter's house was brief, barely 10 minutes. The unease didn't settle in her chest until she reached the unfamiliar street, the quietness of the neighborhood wrapping itself around her like a suffocating fog. His house loomed ahead, a modest building that seemed so ordinary on the outside, but hid darkness behind its walls. The door clicked shut behind her with a finality that would haunt her for the rest of her days. As soon as she entered, the atmosphere shifted. Carter's demeanor changed from polite to threatening. Before she could react, the cold steel of a gun was pressed against her temple. "Do as I say, or I'll kill you." Carter's voice was cold, devoid of any empathy, a far cry from the stranger she had trusted moments ago. Her heart raced, but fear rooted her in place. His words hung in the air like poison, and with that, the terror began. In the dimly lit room, Carter forced her to the floor, slapping her hard across the face whenever she screamed. The sting of his hand was nothing compared to the ice-cold terror that ran through her veins. Each slap was a reminder. Scream, and she would pay with her life. But the physical abuse was only the beginning. As the hours dragged on, Carter's cruelty morphed into something unspeakable. With every threat, every command, she felt her world crumble further. And then came the unimaginable, the horror she could never unsee. He forced her into acts with his dog, acts so vile and grotesque she could scarcely comprehend. It wasn't just the physical violence, it was the mental torture. She was trapped in a nightmare of her own body, a puppet on strings that she couldn't cut. He recorded everything. Each moment was captured, saved, like some sick trophy. The thought of those images, the cold, heartless documentation of her suffering, haunted her, even as she tried to block out the shame and despair that threatened to swallow her whole. Through it all, Carter remained indifferent, calm, as if this were nothing more than a cruel game. He even went so far as to show investigators the footage, brazenly claiming it was all done willingly. But her eyes told a different story, and so did her body, bruised and broken. She was a prisoner, not just in Carter's home, but in the grips of her own fear. Every moment she was there felt like an eternity. As the night wore on, the woman's mind began to fragment. She knew she had to escape, but the terror of what Carter might do to her, what he had already done, kept her paralyzed. Every time she thought she might find an opening, he was there, looming over her, reminding her who had the power in that room. When morning light finally broke through the windows, it did nothing to calm the storm of fear inside her. Carter was no longer a stranger. He was a monster, and in that moment she realized the nightmare wasn't ending anytime soon, but survival was her only choice, and somehow she would find a way to break free, if she could. The morning light had brought no relief, no sense of safety. For the victim, the sunlight felt almost mocking, illuminating the nightmare she could not escape. Inside Carter's house, the hours stretched, weighed down by the suffocating air of fear and desperation. She could feel every second of her captivity, each one slipping away as though it were her last. But in the midst of the darkness, a small sliver of hope began to form. Her mind, fractured by terror, began to claw its way back to clarity. She wasn't just a victim, she was a survivor, and survival meant finding an escape. But how could she get out of a house that felt like a prison, guarded by a man with a gun? How could she overcome the man who seemed to hold her life in his hands? As she carefully assessed the situation, her thoughts swirled. Carter had made one mistake. He'd underestimated her ability to think. And, like any predator, he had overestimated his control over her. The fear she had felt from the first moment had begun to shift into something else, a primal urge to break free. Carter was unpredictable, but he was also methodical. He had a routine, a pattern that he followed with each horrific command. But it was that routine that would be her chance, a chance to outsmart him, to seize control when he let his guard down. The moments between his brutal commands were growing longer, and though each minute felt like an eternity, it gave her time to observe, to plan. As Carter stepped out of the room to fetch something from the kitchen, she saw it, an opening, a fleeting chance for escape. In that brief instant, her body reacted faster than her mind could process. Adrenaline surged as she pushed herself to her feet, clutching the nearest object she could find, an old, rusted lamp from the table. With trembling hands, she smashed it against the floor, creating a loud crash that echoed through the house. The noise, perhaps unintentionally, bought her the time she needed. She could hear Carter's footsteps rushing toward the sound. But she didn't wait. She didn't hesitate. In the chaos that followed, she bolted for the back door. Her legs moved like they had never moved before, fueled by sheer survival instinct. She could hear him behind her, his shouts, his frantic pursuit. But she didn't stop. Every step she took felt like it could be her last. But she kept going. The back gate was just ahead. She pushed it open with all her strength, spilling out into the alley. And just as quickly as she had entered the house, she was free. But the freedom wasn't complete. Her escape wasn't without consequences. Carter, seething with rage, would stop at nothing to recapture her. But the woman was already thinking ahead, thinking about what had to happen next. Her escape was a small victory, but the war was far from over. She ran for blocks, her breath ragged, her mind spinning with confusion and pain. She couldn't stop. She couldn't afford to be caught. In a daze, she finally stumbled upon a woman walking her dog along a busy street. Desperate and exhausted, she turned to her for help. The woman, seeing the fear in her eyes, immediately understood. She called the police. It was over. The nightmare, at least for now, was over. The cold rush of air never felt so sweet. As the woman staggered down the alley, her lungs burning with the strain of her escape, she felt something she hadn't in hours: hope. But hope alone wasn't enough. The terror that had gripped her heart was far from gone, and now, with Carter's rage chasing her, she knew she wasn't safe. Not yet. Every footstep that echoed behind her, every shadow she passed, felt like a prelude to something worse. What if he found her? What if he turned the city upside down looking for her, intent on dragging her back to that nightmare? The realization hit her like a punch to the stomach. I can't go back. But the thought of turning to the police felt almost as daunting. What if they didn't believe her? What if she couldn't prove what had happened inside that house? The recordings, the horror. Would anyone take her seriously? The doubt swirled, but she couldn't afford to waste time. Her body, bruised and broken, had already carried her so far, she wouldn't stop now. With shaky hands, she pulled out her phone, dialing the first number that came to mind. A friend, a family member, anyone who could help. The phone rang for what felt like an eternity before someone finally answered. Through broken sobs, she explained what had happened. The horror, the gun, the violence, the dog. She didn't even pause to breathe, vomiting the words out, desperate to be heard, desperate to be believed. The voice on the other end was calm, but it offered the lifeline she so desperately needed. "I'm coming for you," they said, and in that moment, her body finally relaxed, just a little. But she couldn't stay still. Carter was out there, and she knew it. She had no time to waste. Hours later, police finally arrived at the scene. The officers who found her were grim, their faces hard with the realization of what they had just heard. The victim had told them everything, how she had been picked up, how she was forced to perform unspeakable acts, and the horrifying fact that Carter had filmed it all. But there was something else that troubled them, something that made their blood run cold. The fact that Carter had a history. As the victim was escorted to safety, officers took charge of the scene, combing through Carter's house with precision. What they discovered was both chilling and infuriating. Hidden in his room, they found not only the footage he had shown them, videos that haunted every officer who watched them, but several others, carefully stored, as if they were some twisted collection of trophies. They weren't just random acts of violence, though. The footage painted a pattern, a history of abuse, one that stretched far beyond just this one victim. And it wasn't the first time Carter had preyed on someone weaker than him. The pieces were falling into place. Carter's prior convictions, his history of sexual abuse, and the haunting realization that this was far from an isolated incident. They were all adding up. This man was a repeat offender, and yet somehow he had managed to slip through the cracks of the system, time and time again. Back at the police station, detectives huddled over their findings. The footage was undeniable, yet something gnawed at them. How could Carter justify his actions? How could he claim any of this was consensual? They needed his confession. A few days later, Carter was apprehended. His arrest, as expected, was met with a mixture of shock and rage. For some, it felt like the justice system had failed them yet again. Another predator who had been allowed to roam free, unchecked, until his victim's courage finally put an end to his reign of terror. Carter, however, remained defiant. He sat with detectives during his interview, calmly showing them the footage he had filmed, insisting the woman had participated willingly. He even claimed, shockingly, that he was doing nothing more than offering her an opportunity, though every piece of evidence screamed otherwise. His arrogance was palpable, even as the detectives, armed with the damning footage, questioned him. For the victim, the nightmare wasn't over yet. Her case had just begun. But for Carter, the walls were closing in. The justice she sought was finally within reach. The months that followed her escape were a blur of police interviews, medical examinations, and the constant flood of emotions that would have broken anyone else, but not her. She had survived. And though the trauma had left scars, both physical and psychological, she was determined not to let Carter's actions define her. She wasn't alone, though. The support from her family, the police, and the community had rallied around her. Yet, as the legal process moved forward, she felt the weight of what was to come. The path to justice would be long, filled with hurdles, and every step would force her to relive the horror she'd fought so hard to escape. As Carter sat in his jail cell awaiting trial, the wheels of justice began to slowly turn. But they weren't fast enough. The legal system, like all systems, was flawed, filled with loopholes, delays, and inefficiencies. Carter, though behind bars, seemed to continue his manipulative games. His arrogance never waned. In interviews with his attorneys, he maintained his innocence, convinced that his actions, no matter how vile, could be justified. He painted himself as a victim of a system out to destroy him, ignoring the fact that his victims, the ones whose lives he had destroyed, were finally speaking up. In the court of public opinion, Carter had already been condemned. But in the courtroom, the battle was just beginning. The courtroom became the next battlefield, one where every moment felt like an eternity. The victim, sitting on the stand, was once again forced to face the man who had violated her in ways unimaginable. Her hands shook, her voice faltered, but she stood tall. She had to. For herself. For every person who hadn't survived. For every person who would never get the chance to speak their truth. Her testimony was raw, painful, each word laced with the haunting memories of that night. The audience in the courtroom, the attorneys, the judge, they all watched, riveted, as the woman faced her perpetrator. But even as she spoke, Carter sat there with a cold, detached expression, as though her words meant nothing to him. His defense attorneys worked tirelessly to undermine her, questioning every detail of her account. Was it really him? Did she consent? The courtroom drama was one of psychological warfare. Every word, every glance, every tactic was designed to rattle her, to make her doubt her own reality. But she refused to let that happen. She stood firm, unwavering, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. Then came the damning evidence, the video footage, the sickening recordings Carter had made, the very proof that was both his undoing and the victim's greatest ally. The jury saw it, the world saw it. Each second of that footage played out like a silent scream echoing through the courtroom. Carter's actions, captured in real time, were inescapable. His claim of consent was a lie, shattered by the very proof that made him a monster. The trial wore on, dragging out over weeks, then months. Each day brought new revelations, but it was the victim's testimony that had sealed Carter's fate. She had faced him, accused him, and laid bare the horrors he had forced upon her. His past, his history of violence, and his complete disregard for the law all came to light. The jury was convinced, but the question remained, would Carter ever truly face the consequences of his actions? And then, the verdict. It came down like a hammer, heavy and final. Guilty. Guilty on all counts. The weight of the words didn't just fall on Carter, it fell on the entire courtroom. The victim, though still haunted by the memories of what she had endured, felt something else, too. Relief. It wasn't justice in the purest sense. Nothing could ever undo the pain, but it was a step toward healing. It was a step toward closure. Carter, who had shown no remorse throughout the trial, was finally held accountable. His sentence was long, and though it couldn't reverse the years of pain he had caused, it was a start. He was sent away, locked behind bars where he would remain for the rest of his life as a registered sex offender, a monster in the eyes of society. But for the woman who had bravely fought for justice, the true healing had only just begun. The courtroom was silent as the judge delivered the final verdict. Guilty on all counts. The words were a hammer striking the final blow, and the victim, sitting in the back of the courtroom, let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The battle for justice had been long, agonizing, and filled with moments where she doubted herself. But now, for the first time in months, there was some peace, however fleeting. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel the weight of that small victory. Carter, the man who had held her captive, the man who had violated her in ways she couldn't even speak of without shuddering, was finally going to pay the price. He was going to prison. But peace was short-lived. While the verdict was a step in the right direction, the true battle was only just beginning. The courtroom had been just a brief chapter in her journey, a journey that continued every day, through every whisper, every dark corner, every memory that would return to haunt her at the most unexpected moments. In the days following the trial, the woman found herself struggling to regain her footing in a world that had shifted violently under her. She couldn't go back to the life she had before. Too much had been shattered. The process of healing was slow, painful, and often felt impossible. But there were moments, brief flashes of clarity, when she found strength in unexpected places. She attended therapy sessions where she tried to piece together the fragments of her soul that Carter had stolen from her. Each session was both a release and a reminder of the brutality of what she had endured. The words of the therapist were kind, but they were also a reminder that the road ahead would be long. It wasn't just the physical scars, the bruises that had long since healed, but the invisible ones, the ones that would take years to even acknowledge, let alone address. But she kept going. She couldn't let the man who had broken her control her any longer. She would reclaim her life, no matter how impossible it seemed. As the months passed, news of the trial slowly faded from the headlines. People moved on. For some, it was just another case, another horror story tucked away in the annals of the criminal justice system. But for her, the journey didn't end when the gavel struck. It lived in the quiet moments. The moment when she was alone in a room, the silence wrapping around her like a suffocating blanket. It lived in the sound of a door slamming in the distance, the sudden jolt of fear that would surge through her heart. She couldn't escape the nightmares that had become her new reality. They crept in during her waking hours, a shadow that followed her everywhere she went. The sound of Carter's voice still echoed in her ears. The cold steel of the gun he had pressed to her head felt fresh on her skin. There were days when she couldn't get out of bed, days when the weight of it all seemed too much to bear. She questioned whether she could keep going, whether healing was even possible. But each day she forced herself to try, even if it was just a little. She learned to fight in ways she had never imagined, fighting against her own mind, fighting to regain her sense of self. In the midst of this, something miraculous began to happen. A shift, a slow, almost imperceptible change. She began to talk about it. At first, it was in small, quiet ways. A friend here, a family member there. But the more she spoke, the more the shame that had once consumed her began to unravel. She began to realize that she wasn't alone, that there were other survivors, other voices that had been silenced, but were now finding the strength to speak. In the months following the trial, the woman began to speak publicly about her experience. She shared her story at local support groups, where others who had endured similar horrors offered their support. It wasn't easy. Every word felt like a betrayal, like a reopening of the wounds that had never fully healed. But with every story she shared, the burden lifted just a little. Each survivor she met became a part of her healing. Together, they became stronger than any man who had tried to break them. She wasn't just reclaiming her life. She was helping others reclaim theirs too. And in that process, she began to heal. Meanwhile, Carter's fate was sealed. As he was sent to prison, the reality of his actions began to set in. The public would never forget what he had done. His name would forever be tied to his crimes, and the horror he had inflicted on his victims would follow him until the end of his days. But even as he sat behind bars, there was something about his demeanor, his refusal to acknowledge the damage he had caused, that made it clear. He had not been broken. He was unrepentant, unwilling to face the full consequences of his actions. But for the woman, for the others like her, the most important thing had already happened. She had broken free. She had faced her tormentor, stood up in front of a courtroom, and had her voice heard. She had refused to be another silent victim. As we conclude today's journey into the depths of this chilling crime, we're reminded of the many layers that hide behind each story. The truths we uncover, the mysteries that remain, and the questions that linger long after the investigation is over. These are the things that echo through our minds, keeping us searching for answers. But remember, the story doesn't end here. If this story has left you with more questions than answers, you're not alone. Every crime carries its own dark echo, an unresolved whisper that keeps us on the edge of our seats. So, if you're ready to dive deeper into the mysteries, uncover more shocking cases, and explore the stories that will haunt your thoughts, don't forget to subscribe to Criminals Echoes. Join our community of true crime enthusiasts and be the first to uncover the truth in every twist and turn. Hit that subscribe button, turn on the notification bell, and follow us as we continue to shed light on the darkest corners of criminal history. Have your theories, thoughts, or insights on today's case? Drop them in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. Until next time, keep questioning, keep seeking, and remember, every crime has its echo.